By the summer of 1941, Nazi Germany stood at the height of its power. From the Atlantic coast of France to the gates of Moscow, Adolf Hitler's armies seemed unstoppable. Poland had fallen in weeks. France, once considered Europe's greatest land power, collapsed in just over a month. The Low Countries were crushed, Norway subdued, Yugoslavia and Greece overrun. Across the continent, the swastika flew over capitals that had once believed themselves secure. Britain stood defiant but isolated, battered by air raids and cut off from the European mainland. To many observers, it appeared that the Third Reich had achieved what Imperial Germany could not in the First World War: domination of Europe. Hitler's generals believed time was on their side. His enemies were divided, his armies were battle-hardened, and across the Atlantic, the United States remained officially neutral. America in 1941 was not yet a nation at war. The trauma of the First World War still lingered in public memory. Isolationist voices argued that Europe's conflicts were not America's burden. The country was emerging from the Great Depression, focused inward, rebuilding industry and stabilizing its economy. President Franklin Roosevelt supported Britain through Lend-Lease aid, sending ships, weapons, and supplies across a dangerous Atlantic, but he moved cautiously. Many Americans believed oceans were enough to protect them. Hitler, watching from Berlin, saw a country politically divided, militarily unprepared, and reluctant to fight. He dismissed American industrial strength as exaggerated and doubted its willingness to sacrifice blood for a European war. Then, on December 7, 1941, everything changed with the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japanese aircraft struck the American Pacific Fleet in Hawaii, sinking battleships and killing over 2,000 Americans in a single morning. The following day, the United States declared war on Japan. 4 days later, in a decision that still puzzles historians, Hitler declared war on the United States. He was not obligated to do so under the Tripartite Pact, yet he chose to widen the conflict. Perhaps he believed America would focus entirely on Japan. Perhaps he underestimated American resolve. Or perhaps, flush with victories in Europe and deep inside Soviet territory under Operation Barbarossa, he believed the war was already won. What Hitler did not fully grasp was the scale of the power he had just provoked. The United States was not merely another army to face on the battlefield. It was the largest industrial economy in the world. Its factories, once producing cars and refrigerators, could be transformed into engines of war. Its population exceeded 130 million people. Its natural resources were vast. Its geographic position made invasion nearly impossible. And once mobilized, its production capacity would dwarf that of Germany and its allies combined. Within months, American shipyards would launch vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them. Aircraft plants would produce bombers in numbers that darkened European skies. Training camps would fill with millions of young men preparing to cross an ocean and fight on foreign soil. At first, Germany did not feel the full weight of this transformation. In early 1942, U-boats prowled the American coastline, sinking ships within sight of shore in what German submariners called a second happy time. The Wehrmacht continued grinding. Forward in the Soviet Union, North Africa remained contested. On paper, the Axis still looked formidable, but beneath the surface, something irreversible had begun. American industry was accelerating. Convoys were forming. troops were training. Strategists in Washington and London were coordinating a long war, one based not just on tactics, but on overwhelming economic superiority. When Germany declared war on the United States, it assumed it was adding one more opponent to an already crowded battlefield. Instead, it triggered the full mobilization of a nation capable of fighting on two oceans at once. The entry of the United States did not bring immediate victory. It did not erase the sacrifices of Britain or the staggering losses of the Soviet Union, but it fundamentally changed the balance of power. The war was no longer a contest of swift campaigns and lightning offensives. It became a struggle of production, endurance, and global reach. And in that kind of war, the United States possessed advantages that Germany could not match. From that moment forward, the conflict ceased to be a European war with distant observers. It became a truly global confrontation. German soldiers would soon face not only British and Soviet forces, but an ever-growing American presence in the skies above their cities, on the beaches of occupied Europe, and eventually on German soil itself. The decision made in December 1941 did not cause Germany's immediate collapse, but it ensured that the Third Reich would now face the full industrial, military, and human power of the United States, force that, once unleashed, would not stop until Berlin fell. When America entered the war against Nazi Germany, it did not begin with a single decisive battle. It began with production. Almost overnight, American industry transformed itself into what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Automobile factories in Detroit stopped building cars and began assembling tanks. Appliance manufacturers turned out machine guns and aircraft parts. Shipyards along the East and Gulf coasts worked around the clock. What made this mobilization extraordinary was not only its speed, but its scale. The United States possessed vast natural resources, iron, coal, oil land, a labor force capable of expanding rapidly. Millions of men enlisted or were drafted, while millions of women entered factories, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. By 1943, American plants were producing tens of thousands of aircraft per year, along with ships, artillery, trucks, and ammunition in staggering quantities. Liberty ships were launched so quickly that some were completed in a matter of weeks. In contrast, Germany's industrial base, though formidable, was constrained by limited resources, forced labor inefficiencies, and increasing Allied bombing. Hitler had prepared for lightning wars, not a prolonged industrial struggle against the world's largest economy. As American production surged, the balance of power began to shift in ways that could not be reversed. Germany was no longer fighting a collection of opponents. It was confronting an economic giant capable of sustaining and supplying a global conflict indefinitely. The first test of that growing power came in the Atlantic. German U-boats had long threatened Britain's survival by targeting merchant shipping. In early 1942, submarines struck American vessels along the East Coast, sinking ships within sight of shore. For a time, it seemed Germany might sever the vital supply lines linking North America to Europe. But the United States responded with speed and coordination. Convoy systems were expanded, grouping merchant ships under naval escort. Advances in radar, sonar, and long-range patrol aircraft tightened the noose around German submarines. Intelligence breakthroughs, including efforts connected to cracking the Enigma code, provided critical insight into U-boat movements. By mid-1943, the tide had turned. American shipyards were replacing lost vessels faster than Germany could destroy them, and U-boat losses mounted at an unsustainable rate. The Atlantic sea lanes were secured, allowing a constant flow of troops, fuel, food, and weapons to Britain and beyond. Control of the ocean meant control of the war's logistics. Without it, an invasion of Europe would have been impossible. With it, Germany faced the certainty that American soldiers and machines would eventually arrive in overwhelming numbers. As supplies crossed safely into Europe, the air war intensified. The United States Army Air Forces launched a strategic bombing campaign aimed at crippling Germany's industrial heart. Flying by day while British bombers struck by night, Allied air forces targeted aircraft factories, ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, rail networks, and submarine yards. Early missions, such as the costly raids over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, exposed American bombers to fierce fighter attacks. Losses were heavy, and doubts grew about the strategy. But the arrival of long-range escort fighters, especially the P-51 Mustang, changed the equation. By 1944, American fighters could accompany bombers deep into German territory, challenging and gradually overwhelming the Luftwaffe. Oil production collapsed under sustained bombardment, rail systems were disrupted, and German industry struggled to recover. Cities suffered immense destruction, and civilian morale wavered. The air campaign did not win the war alone, but it systematically weakened Germany's ability to wage it. Planes destroyed on the ground could not defend the skies. Fuel shortages grounded pilots, factories reduced output. When American troops eventually landed in Western Europe, they did so against an enemy already strained from above. That landing came on June 6, 1944 day. After years of planning and deception, Allied forces crossed the English Channel in the largest amphibious invasion in history. American troops stormed the beaches at Omaha and Utah, facing entrenched German defenses, artillery fire, and machine gun nests. At Omaha Beach, casualties were severe, and for hours the outcome hung in the balance. Yet the sheer scale of the operation, thousands of ships, aircraft overhead, airborne divisions landing behind enemy lines, overwhelmed German capacity to respond. Once a foothold was secured, American forces pushed inland, breaking through hedgerow country and eventually encircling German units in Normandy. The liberation of Paris followed, and the Western Front was fully reopened. Germany now faced powerful American armies advancing from the west, while Soviet forces pressed relentlessly from the east. The strategic situation Hitler had long feared, encirclement on two fronts, was now a reality, amplified by the material and manpower strength of the United States. Even so, Germany attempted one final gamble. In December 1944, Hitler launched a surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, aiming to split Allied lines in what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. American forces, caught off guard, endured bitter winter fighting under brutal conditions. Towns like Bastogne became symbols of stubborn resistance. Despite initial German gains, fuel shortages and stiff American defense stalled the advance. Reinforcements, superior logistics, and relentless air power, once the weather cleared, turned the tide. The offensive drained Germany's remaining reserves. From that point forward, the end accelerated. American forces crossed the Rhine River, pushing deep into western Germany. Industrial centers fell. Supply lines collapsed. Meanwhile, Soviet troops closed in from the east. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was crumbling. Hitler retreated into his bunker as Allied armies converged. In May 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally when it had declared war on the United States in 1941. It had unleashed a force that combined industrial dominance, logistical mastery, and military power on an unprecedented scale. By 1945, that force stood victorious on German soil. As American armies drove deeper into Germany in the spring of 1945, the consequences of 4 years of total war became unmistakable. Entire cities lay in ruins from sustained bombing. Rail lines were shattered. Bridges collapsed into rivers. Fuel depots stood empty. The once feared Wehrmacht was reduced to fragmented units, some still fighting fiercely, others surrendering in waves. What had begun as a campaign of lightning offensives and rapid territorial conquest had ended in desperate defensive battles on German soil. American divisions advanced methodically, supported by overwhelming artillery, armor, and air power. Supply convoys stretched for miles behind the front lines, delivering ammunition, food, and fuel with a logistical precision Germany could no longer match. The difference in capacity was stark. While German units rationed bullets and gasoline, American forces operated with a depth of resources that reflected the full weight of U.S. industry. The crossing of the Rhine River symbolized the final breach of Germany's last major natural defense. Once Allied troops established bridgeheads, resistance became increasingly fragmented. Industrial centers in the Ruhrgebiet, the heart of German war production, were encircled and captured. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were taken prisoner in massive surrenders. Civilians, exhausted and disillusioned, watched as columns of American troops moved through shattered towns. For many, the promise of a 1,000-year Reich had dissolved into smoke and rubble in barely 12 years. At the same time, American forces uncovered the horrifying reality of the Nazi concentration camp system. The liberation of camps such as Buchenwald and Dachau exposed the scale of the regime's crimes. Starving survivors, mass graves, and evidence of systematic murder stunned even hardened soldiers. These discoveries reinforced the sense that this was not merely a geopolitical struggle, but a moral confrontation with a regime built on brutality and racial hatred. The war in Europe was no longer only about territory or strategy. It was about ending a system that had inflicted suffering on an unprecedented scale. Meanwhile, from the east, Soviet forces closed in on Berlin. Germany was being crushed from both directions, exactly the two-front nightmare Hitler had once tried to avoid. American and Soviet troops eventually linked up along the Elbe River, a symbolic meeting that marked the effective division of what remained of Nazi-controlled territory. Berlin fell to the Soviets after intense urban fighting. In late April 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life in his bunker beneath the city. Days later, Germany's remaining leadership sought terms. On May 7, 1945, Germany signed an unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. The decision to declare war on the United States in December 1941 had seemed bold at the time. An expansion of a conflict Germany believed it was winning. Instead, it ensured that the Third Reich would face not only the resilience of Britain and the immense manpower of the Soviet Union, but also the industrial and military might of the United States. In the end, it was that combined weight — factories, ships, aircraft, soldiers, and sustained logistics that Germany could not withstand. Germany's surrender did not erase the devastation that had consumed Europe, nor did it diminish the staggering human cost of the war. But it marked the unmistakable conclusion of a strategic miscalculation that had reshaped the conflict. When Hitler declared war on the United States in December 1941, he believed he was acting from a position of strength. His armies were deep inside Soviet territory. Western Europe was firmly under German control. Britain stood alone on its island. From Berlin's perspective, America appeared distant, divided, and slow to mobilize. What followed proved how profoundly that judgment underestimated the character and capacity of the United States. American power in World War II was not defined by a single battle or one dramatic breakthrough. It was cumulative. It was the steady expansion of shipyards that outbuilt submarine campaigns. It was aircraft production that replaced losses faster than Germany could inflict them. It was the training and deployment of millions of soldiers who crossed an ocean and established a permanent front in Western Europe. It was the logistical system that delivered fuel, ammunition, food, and medical care across thousands of miles with relentless efficiency. Germany had prepared for rapid, decisive campaigns. It had not prepared for a prolonged contest against an economy capable of expanding almost without limit. By 1945, the imbalance was undeniable. American factories had produced more than 300,000 aircraft during the war, tens of thousands of tanks, and millions of trucks and artillery pieces. Liberty ships and other cargo vessels had carried the material foundation of Allied victory across the Atlantic in an unbroken stream. On the battlefield, American forces demonstrated not only numerical strength but operational adaptability. Learning from early setbacks in North Africa, refining tactics in Italy, and executing complex amphibious operations in Normandy and beyond. Each year of war strengthened the United States. Each year strained Germany further. Yet it is important to understand that Germany did not fall solely because of American power. The Soviet Union bore immense casualties and inflicted catastrophic losses on the German army in the East. Britain endured years of bombing and maintained resistance when defeat seemed possible. Resistance movements across occupied Europe weakened German control from within. But American entry ensured that the Axis faced a coalition whose combined industrial and human resources far exceeded its own. The United States became the central pillar of that coalition's material strength. In the end, when American soldiers stood amid the ruins of German cities, the outcome reflected more than battlefield courage. It reflected the consequences of strategic overreach. Germany had chosen to fight a global war against adversaries whose economic depth and geographic security made them uniquely difficult to defeat. The decision to bring the United States into the conflict transformed the war from a European struggle into an industrial contest on a global scale. And in that contest, once fully engaged, America's power proved overwhelming. In the aftermath of Germany's surrender, military analysts and historians began examining the chain of decisions that led to the Reich's destruction. Among them, the declaration of war against the United States stands out as one of the most consequential. It was not forced, it was not inevitable. It was a choice rooted in ideology, confidence, and miscalculation. Hitler viewed the United States as a racially mixed, politically divided society, incapable of sustained sacrifice. He believed its democracy made it weak. He believed its military was inexperienced. What he failed to recognize was that American political division could transform into unity under direct attack, and that democratic industry, once mobilized, could outperform authoritarian control. The United States did not simply add troops to the battlefield, it added scale. American shipbuilding neutralized the U-boat threat. American air power crippled German oil production and transportation networks. American financial and industrial output sustained not only its own forces, but also supported allies through equipment and supplies. Even as the Soviet Union absorbed and shattered the bulk of Germany's land forces in the East, it was American trucks, locomotives, and food shipments that helped sustain the Red Army's momentum. The war effort became interconnected, and at its center was American production capacity. For German commanders in 1944 and 1945, the evidence was visible every day. Endless Allied aircraft overhead, artillery barrages backed by seemingly limitless ammunition, fresh divisions arriving at the front while German units were forced to merge remnants together, fuel shortages that immobilized tanks, training programs shortened to push inexperienced recruits into battle. The contrast between Germany's shrinking capabilities and America's expanding ones was impossible to ignore. When American and Soviet troops met at the Elbe River, it symbolized more than the physical splitting of Germany. It represented the strategic enclosure that had become unavoidable once the United States entered the war. Germany had gambled on rapid victories and divided enemies. Instead, it faced coordination among industrial giants. The two-front war that German leaders feared during World War I had returned this time with far greater consequences. In the broader arc of the 20th century, America's confrontation with Nazi Germany reshaped global power. By 1945, the United States emerged not only as a victorious combatant, but as a dominant economic and military force. Its homeland remained untouched by invasion. Its factories were stronger than ever. Its armed forces were experienced and globally deployed. Germany, by contrast, lay divided, occupied, and devastated. The story of when Germany faced the full power of America is not a single moment on a battlefield. It is the story of what happens when industrial strength, logistical reach, and sustained military commitment converge. It is the story of a dictatorship that underestimated a democracy's capacity to mobilize. And ultimately, it is the story of how a global war was decided not only by strategy and courage, but by the overwhelming weight of production and persistence that Germany could no longer withstand. By the time the guns fell silent in May 1945, the world that Nazi Germany had tried to build lay in ruins. The cities that once echoed with the chants of mass rallies were reduced to shattered stone and twisted steel. The armies that had marched triumphantly across Europe were disarmed, defeated, and captured. The leadership that promised a 1,000-year empire had survived barely 12 years. And standing amid the wreckage was a coalition of nations that Germany had believed it could outmaneuver, outfight, and outlast. When Hitler declared war on the United States in December 1941, he believed he was acting boldly, even strategically. He assumed America would be distracted in the Pacific. He assumed its democracy would slow its response. He assumed distance would limit its impact. Instead, that decision ensured Germany would face not just another enemy, but the full industrial, military, and economic power of the largest economy on Earth. Once mobilized, the United States became a force defined by scale of production, scale of logistics, scale of manpower. It was not a single strike that defeated the Third Reich. It was accumulation. It was pressure applied relentlessly at sea, in the air, and on land until Germany could no longer sustain resistance. But this story is not one of America alone. The Soviet Union bore catastrophic losses and destroyed the core of the German army in the East. Britain endured years of bombing and maintained the fight when defeat seemed possible. Resistance movements undermined occupation from within. Victory in Europe was the result of combined effort and sacrifice. Yet the entry of the United States changed the equation permanently. It guaranteed that Germany would face enemies whose combined resources far exceeded its own. In the end, Germany did not fall in a sudden collapse. It was worn down, economically strangled, strategically encircled, militarily exhausted. The gamble to widen the war sealed its fate by choosing to confront the United States. The Third Reich transformed a continental conflict into a global struggle it could not win. When Germany faced the full power of America, it faced more than soldiers on a battlefield. It faced factories that never slept, shipyards that never stopped, and a nation that, once committed, would see the war through to unconditional surrender. And in that confrontation, the balance of the 20th century shifted forever.